Kristin Vekasi.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you so much for coming today. Now that everyone's eaten, we turn the lights down, goes off, for my coffee's close at hand. So the title of my talk today is An End of Pacifism, Japanese Remilitarization and Outlooks for Global Stability. Now, I will be addressing current events, and I'm happy to take questions about things including President Trump's upcoming trip to Asia, which will deal with a lot of the issues I bring up in my talk today. But one of the goals for this talk is to give you sort of a deep context, a historical context for what perhaps Japanese remilitarization would look like, why it might happen now, and what the dimensions of Japanese remilitarization may be. Japan is famous for having what is called the Peace Constitution. It was ratified in 1947 when Japan was under American occupation following what is called the Pacific War in Japan, or what we of course call World War II. And I'm going to contextualize the Japanese Peace Constitution and talk about possible either reinterpretation or revision of the Peace Constitution and what that might mean for regional politics and also the United States role in the region. It's somewhat of a scary time to be in Asia. On September 29th of this year, North Korean missile flew over the northernmost island of Japan, Hokkaido. You see here on Japanese national news, the NHK. This is showing the trajectory of the North Korean missile that flew straight over part of the Japanese island, the Japanese homeland. Following these threats, particularly in Hokkaido, the Japanese government started instituting missile drills. You see here, this is at a senior day center where Japanese seniors go to spend their days together to avoid social isolation, practicing ducking and covering. Maybe we have little kids at school practicing the same thing in order to be ready for this potential military threat from North Korea. We also have the Japanese Prime Minister, Abe Shinzo. You're going to hear a lot about him today, saying things like this. So here we have Abe Shinzo in front of the slogan for his political party, Kono Kuni o Momorinuku, protect this country to the end, protect this country without end. And he says, people of Japan, be confident. Isn't it time to hold deep debate about revising the Peace Constitution? For the future of Japan, shouldn't we accomplish in this parliament the biggest reform since the end of the war? Now, note, he does not say this after a North Korean missile flies over Hokkaido. He says this on February 12, 2015. Similarly, so this year, May of this year, again before the North Korean threat had become this pressing, he says, I want to make 2020 the year that a new constitution comes into effect. So Prime Minister Abe has a goal to, and has held this goal for now actually many decades, to revise the Japanese Peace Constitution, become what he calls a more normal country, and put Japan in a place to be able to counter threats like the North Korean threat, but also sort of a broader regional threats. And he also wants to cement his legacy, an issue I'll talk about more. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to contextualize these politics in post-war history and explain what the process might look like going forward. So 1941. Don't worry, I'm not going year by year anymore. So 1941 is the height of Japanese imperialism. The Japanese imperial reach into Asia and Russia as well started in the 1890s. First, they actually pushed into Hokkaido, which is now still part of Japan. But through the first half of the 20th century, Japan colonized northern China, then pushed into southern China as well, throughout Southeast Asia. Most of these occupations were brutal. There are memories lingering in all the occupied countries, perhaps particularly in South Korea, North Korea, China, the Philippines, Indonesia, the memories of Japanese imperialism and occupation. And they pushed, as you can see, right, so the red is places that were formerly within the Japanese Empire, and then the places that are other colors is where Japan had made a further military push. Now, as we know, Japan's imperial project, and I think thank goodness, but Japan's imperial project fails. And it fails to the ruination of the country. So I just have a couple of photos here. First, we have Tokyo in 1945, after the fire bombings of the largest city in Japan. Most of it burned down and was flattened, not all of it. And all Japan's cities, except for 4, were bombed, and their industrial capacity was flattened by mid-1945 as part of the Allied war effort against the Japanese Imperial Army. Similarly, we have a picture here. This is a ration line in a part of Tokyo called Ginza, which has now recovered spectacularly. This is in 1946, 1 year after the war. And we know that not only was there a complete wipeout of Japanese manufacturing capacity, a great loss of life, the complete hollowing out of a young generation, but Japan also has been the only country to suffer from being the target of nuclear weapons. And that, as well as Russian invasion into China and many other factors, led to the end of the war. So Japan's imperial project fails. The Japanese militarist push fails completely. Following the end of the war, particularly the United States, but also our allies, move in and occupy Japan. And we occupied Japan from 1945 to the mainland from 1945 to 1952. During this period, early on, the United States, in conjunction with the Japanese, write a new constitution for Japan. This constitution ensures things that Americans hold dear, such as freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. It also enshrines things like the freedom of workers to unionize, a fairly strong welfare state, land reform, many different things. But what is that this Constitution is most noteworthy for is Article 9, which is the peace clause of the Japanese post-war Constitution. So Article 9 says, aspiring sincerely to an international peace based on justice and order, the Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation and the threat or use of force as a means of settling international disputes. Paragraph 2 says, in order to accomplish the aim of the preceding paragraph, land, sea, and air forces, as well as other war potentials, will never be maintained. The right of belligerency of the state will not be recognized. Now, these two clauses are fairly straightforward. Japan will not have a military. They will not have the right to use war in order to further their interests. This constitution, again, was sort of adopted under duress. This photo here shows the head of the Allied powers, General MacArthur, standing next to what is known as the Showa Emperor in Japan, right, Emperor Hirohito. You can see, in particular, this picture shows the power relations between the United States and Japan at this time. So Hirohito, the Showa Emperor, had been very much a revered figure, and in many ways continues to be so. And MacArthur, forgive my posture for a second. There he is. No big deal. So the Constitution is promulgated under these circumstances, and to this day has yet to be revised once. So the Constitution that was put in place and enforced in 1947 under occupation has never been revised. In many ways, this is not for a lack of trying, but for structural reasons. In order to amend or revise the Japanese Constitution, you need a 2/3 majority in the lower house of parliament, in the upper house of parliament, and then it gets put to a national referendum, and you need a majority of Japanese citizens to agree to any revision. It's a high bar to amend the Constitution. As the Cold War started to heat up, so we think this is 1947, we have a peace constitution. 2 years later, 1949, Chinese Communist Party wins the civil war in China, and Chinese mainland becomes communist. The Nationalist Party, which was allied with the United States, flees to Taiwan and establishes the Republic of China there. And at this point, suddenly, Japan, as an American ally in Asia, becomes a really pivotal, crucial place for the United States to have an ally. At this point, we have what is called the reverse course in the American occupation of Japan. In Japanese, it's the Gyakukosu, reverse course. And there's more of an effort to suddenly remilitarize Japan and make Japan an ally of the United States in the Cold War in order to counter Russia and counter China, and in particular to make sure that Japan itself does not turn communist, which actually was a concern in the 1940s. So the leaders of Japan, the United States, have shared interests in the Cold War, shared national security interests, and in order to counter these, within the context of this peace constitution, we sign a security alliance, a mutual security treaty. Part of the aspects of this treaty is that there's an American forward presence in Asia that is established and maintained through bases in Japan. We have naval forces there, air forces there, we have Marines based in the southern islands of Okinawa, and we have limited army presence. We have a little bit of army in Japan. Most of those forces are in Korea at this point. But they're based in Japan. Japan provides material support in terms of providing land, infrastructure, workers to maintain that infrastructure, and at this point about $2 billion a year to maintain U.S. troops there. And in exchange, the United States provides security, national security for Japan. That is provided through, Japan is under the U.S. nuclear umbrella. And the United States has a commitment that if Japan is attacked, that the United States will come to Japan's aid. On the other side of this coin, besides the support that Japan provides for U.S. forces, American forces in Japan, Japan is fairly hamstrung by its pacifist constitution as to other forms of support that it can provide. Well, if you put this in the context of the 1940s, the early 1950s, Japan has no standing army and is adhering to the letter to the peace constitution. In this picture here, we have Japanese Prime Minister Kishi and President Eisenhower signing the first version of the U.S.-Japan security treaty, which is called AMPO in Japanese. Kishi, interestingly, this is sort of illustrates the politics of the reverse course, was a wartime minister and was one of the architects of the Japanese Empire. And he was purged in the immediate post-war, and then when there was a turn more towards Cold War politics, not only was he let out of jail, but he was welcomed back into the highest echelons and ultimately was elected prime minister and served for many years, and was the architect of this U.S.-Japan security alliance. The duality of having a peace constitution, which disallows the use of belligerency, and a close security alliance with the most powerful military force in the world, the United States, led to an interesting domestic political balance in Japan. And this is what was typically called the Yoshida Doctrine, after Prime Minister Yoshida in the Japanese post-war period. So what Yoshida said to the Japanese people and what his politics were is that he would focus Japanese policy on economic growth. In particular, he had something called the income doubling plan. He said that he would double the income of every Japanese in 10 years. He did it in 6. The picture on the left there shows Ginza again. This is about 10 years later. This is no longer these ration lines, but smart young people out for a stroll in the city. This is the Shinkansen, the fastest train in the world, unveiled at the 1964 Tokyo Olympics, where we have this miraculous high-speed economic growth and recovery. This is explicitly enabled by Japan's ability to focus on the economy and not on national security. This isn't an easy part of the world to live in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. There's the Korean War. There's constant tension between Taiwan and China. It's on the doorstep of Russia. This is sort of a tough neighborhood, and Japan is able to focus its domestic political priorities solely on economic growth because of the U.S.-Japan Security Alliance. Now, it's not that they don't make contributions. They do, and it requires hosting foreign troops, many foreign troops. Right now we have 50,000. Thousands of foreign troops on your soil and being a basing place for, at this point, the Korean War, and then later the Vietnam War and other issues. But that was the basis, one of the bases of this very high-speed economic growth. So this sounds pretty good for Japan, but many people opposed. So there's intense domestic opposition to the Yoshida Doctrine and the U.S.-Japan Security Alliance all through the post-war period. So this is I'm going to show you a bunch of demonstration pictures. But there's a few different bases for why Japanese people oppose this. So this picture on the top with the train, it says, the characters say "Anpo Hantai," which means, or we oppose the security alliance. This was done by the Railway Workers Union. But many of the workers' unions, labor unions in Japan, were fiercely opposed to the security alliance. The reason that they were opposed is they felt that they had been duped into participating in this war, and that it had been for the benefit of superiors. They had been lied to, they had died, and then they were told, that's fine, now we have to cooperate with the United States. This was not a reality they were willing to accept, and they were not happy about the possibility of going to war again. Particularly the teachers' unions in Japan were stridently anti-war and anti-U.S.-Japan Security Alliance. They had taught their students that the war, the Japanese Empire was a good thing. They had sent their students out to die, and then they were told that it was for nothing. They were not going to go down that route again. So you see this picture of parents with their children. It looks a little unclear that it's a little small. Their children have banners, things saying like, I hate war, I'm against war, things like this. So we have this labor component, a family component, and also students. You see here students have broken into the Parliament building, and there's their water cannons driving them out right prior to the signing of one of the U.S.-Japan security treaties. So I want to emphasize that the U.S.-Japan Security Alliance was very beneficial to Japan in the aggregate, on the macro level. It facilitated economic growth, it facilitated Japan's recovery, but it was also a very tricky issue domestically, and the thought of returning to militarism in post-war Japan was very ardently opposed by a majority of Japanese. In this context, Japan started slowly moving towards de facto remilitarization. Now it is quite clear in the Constitution, but we don't merely need to be constitutional scholars to say that you can't have land, air, or sea forces. You don't have the right of belligerency to say that, yeah, that means that you can't have an army. It's pretty clear. That said, in 1940, there was a creation of something called the National Police Reserve that looked a lot like a military by another name. And 4 years later, indeed, we saw that it was a military by another name, and they renamed the National Police Reserve the Japan Self-Defense Forces, or the JSDF. From 1954, about the next 50 years, the JSDF was challenged legally. It was of perhaps dubious constitutionality, but was always upheld in the courts of law. It slowly expanded from a force of about 70,000. I actually don't know the total number now, but we are in the hundreds of thousands now. Military spending in Japan has been capped at 1% of GDP, but it's been consistently at 1% of GDP. Yes?
Is it a voluntary service, or is there a draft?
It's a voluntary service, completely voluntary, and it's right now they're facing some challenges with that. With Japan is aging population, and the self-defense forces are also aging, and they're having trouble recruiting young people in. But we'll see what happens there. But I suspect that the numbers are going to start going down soon because of that issue. So it was capped at 1% of GDP. That was what was considered legal. But Japan is now the third largest economy in the world, so 1% of GDP is larger than most military budgets. And I believe that, so Japan used to be number 4 in the world with the amount that they would spend on the military. With the rise of some other countries, it's probably now around 6. I'm not sure. In 2006, there was another sort of move toward legitimization of this Japan Self-Defense Forces when a Ministry of Defense was created. So prior to that, military decisions had been under the cabinet office, but then they got an entire ministry with making it much more legitimate. In 1991, international deployments of the Japanese Self-Defense Forces began. I'll explain what they were in just a moment. The humanitarian relief, disaster relief, things like that. And in 2004, the Japan Self-Defense Forces were for the first time deployed to a war zone, and they went to Iraq for humanitarian relief. And they were not in active combat, but they were deployed to a war zone. So we see this turning and this gradual remilitarization. So what do they do? So the humanitarian relief is a big part of it. Reconstruction work, like building bridges, building roads, things like this. They cooperate with peacekeeping operations, including in Sudan and South Sudan. During the war in Afghanistan, they've been involved with a refueling mission for British and American troops, and sort of in harm's way a little bit, doing a lot of international disaster relief, a lot of domestic disaster relief. So after, for example, the tsunami and the triple disaster, earthquake and tsunami, and Fukushima Daiichi power plant meltdown in 2001, they did a lot of work there, recent earthquakes, etc. They've done minesweeping operations in the Persian Gulf and anti-piracy activities, including in the South China Sea. People have questions about Japan's stance there. It's quite interesting. So Japan Self-Defense Forces are doing this. They are, by many reports, are doing very good work. Problem is that this is likely unconstitutional. The standing line, and what most politicians and legal scholars agree in Japan, is that about 2/3 of constitutional scholars and judges agree that the existence of the Japanese Self-Defense Forces is against the Japanese Constitution. So what will they do? So in 2014, there was a move to try, by Prime Minister Abe, to try and expand the role of the Japanese Self-Defense Forces and make some of the things they do a little more legitimate. So he passed through the Diet, through the Parliament, a security bill that includes the phrase collective self-defense. So what this is supposed to, what this bill does is that it says that Japan and the Japanese Self-Defense Forces not only can defend Japan itself, but can also come to the aid of Japan's allies. Particularly, this is thinking about the United States. So if this is then legal under this new bill, which again isn't a constitutional revision, so it doesn't solve this root problem, but then it would be okay to do these anti-piracy activities, to participate in peacekeeping, because it's part of collective self-defense, Japan coming to the aid of its allies. Once again, this redefinition of Article 9 came under intense domestic opposition. So this sort of square building in the back there is the Diet building, the Parliament building. There are about 300,000 people in the streets completely surrounding it for about 4 days while the Diet was in session, and as we say in American politics, they rammed it through. So they passed this bill. One of the things Prime Minister Abe likes to talk about is building a beautiful country. Building a utsukushi kune, utsukushi Nihon. And his image of a beautiful country is one that has that is prosperous, that has maybe more traditional conservative family roles, that has the right of a normal country to have self-defense, and Japan has a new, stronger place in the world. So this on the left there, it says, in a beautiful Japan, we don't need new privacy laws. We don't need the right of collective self-defense. Let's not allow that. Of course, we see go stopping on the right. So Abe still has a problem, and he has this new collective self-defense bill. He does pass it. The protesters, of course, go home. Actually, they haven't all gone home. There's still about 50 out there all the time, rain or shine, passing out brochures when you walk by the building. But he really would like to get rid of this legal constitutional issue. And so the path forward that Abe would like to take. So I think what he would really like to do, and this has been his goal for decades. He's a long-term politician. His father and grandfather were both prime ministers. He's a very political family. And he really would like to get rid of Article 9 entirely. As you'll see in a minute, there still is quite a bit of opposition to that. So what he has decided is to simply add a new paragraph to the Constitution. So these are, right here we have the first two untouched, and we haven't actually seen the text of the proposed revision yet. But what it will be is a third paragraph that explicitly legalizes and legitimizes the presence of the self-defense force. So this is in some ways an odd approach, right? So first it says you can't have forces, and says, oh, but you can't have a self-defense force. The reason Abe would like taking this path, I think, and others think, is that this is something that he can probably get support for. This is something that might pass. And he would like to be the person, if you recall the quote, he wants to be the person that changes the Constitution. He wants to be the person that makes the largest change in Japanese post-war politics. There was an election last week, right, in Japan. And in part, this election, Abe said that if he called a snap election, he didn't need to do so for a couple of years, but he dissolved parliament and called a snap election. He said it was in order to get a stronger mandate for negotiating or dealing with North Korea. Most people, including myself, think that this was probably trying to increase his vote share in order to get 2/3 majority to push through constitutional revision. It was a little touch and go for a couple of weeks. They only have about a 5-week campaigning period in Japan. Can you imagine? You only had to do it for 5 weeks. There was a little touch and go. The main opposition party is the Democratic Party of Japan. The party in the midst of those 5 weeks collapsed. It dissolved, and 3 new parties formed, including a Party of Hope, which is a completely new party, Constitutional Democratic Party, and a few other smaller parties. There are also some far left-wing parties, the Japanese Socialist Party, the Japanese Communist Party. And it seems that Abe may actually lose his seat for a brief time, but ultimately he prevailed and managed to not only increase his vote share just a little bit, but also it seems like he does have that 2/3 majority with his party, the Liberal Democratic Party, and the party called Komeito, which is their coalition partner. Japanese party politics are really fun and a little complicated. If people have any questions, but I'm happy to talk about them. But the important thing here is that there are some differences. In particular, Komeito is not as stridently for constitutional revision as the Liberal Democratic Party. But they probably will be willing to vote for this sort of milquetoast, yeah, the SDF is legal, not sort of status quo, legitimizing, legalizing the status quo revision. Public support for constitutional revision, on the other hand, is really mixed. So remember, there are 2 components. First, you need the 2/3 majority in the houses, and then second, you need to have 50%. So if people are interested in explaining the ups and downs here, I can talk about these numbers at length. I'm not going to right now. So the cabinet of Japan, the Prime Minister's office, used to ask about support for Article 9. They stopped doing so in the 1990s because they decided it was all bad news for them. They wanted to change it. No one else wanted to. They decided just to stop asking the question. So we don't actually have, from the post-war period until now, how public opinion has changed. So newspapers do ask. And as you can see, so this blue here are people indicating that there's a need to revise. And the orange is that there's no need to revise. And that for a period in the early mid-2000s, the aughts, there was a majority by this center-left newspaper that said we need to revise, but now there is no longer a majority saying that. Now it's 55-37. The center-right newspaper, Yomiuri Shimbun, on the other hand, has a little bit more, I guess, good news, but it's really split 50-50. Like there's a lot, it's a very divided Japan. The center Nikkei newspaper, similarly, so that here this orange is maintain and blue is revise. So it seems like there's not a lot of support, that they wouldn't be able to get this 50%. Surveys that have asked, right, what should we do, or why do we want to do this, is that there isn't, so this orange bar here is our respondents that say that you need to do something, you have to change this, but only 35% of those people actually say they want revision, so it's unclear. And this is really interesting. So this is asking reasons for supporting constitutional revision. And one of these questions, so the second right here, this is saying, why should we change it? Well, we should change it because the United States forced it on us. And it's time for us to move beyond the occupation constitution. And that does not mean that those respondents want to move towards militarism, right? They're saying it's time for a change. The Constitution was written in English and translated into Japanese. We should have a Japanese Constitution for Japan. The right on the bottom, that does say the current Constitution does not mention enough on national defense, right? So there is, and that's about half of respondents. So there also is, among those who want to change the Constitution, national defense is a concern. So if Japan does change its Constitution, I'll be clear that I'm not sure that will actually change the status quo within Japan. This doesn't mean that Japan's about to get nuclear weapons. It doesn't mean that Japan is about to develop offensive capabilities and recolonize Guam or take over South Korea. Right? That's not what remilitarization in Japan means. It means constitutional revision and maybe a solidification of the status quo, coming out of the shadows for the Japanese self-defense forces. That said, that is not how that action will be interpreted in the region. So Japan, of course, is in this neighborhood right across the Sea of Japan, or the East Sea if you're Korean. It's important naming. From North Korea and South Korea, Korean Peninsula. And they're close neighbors and always will be from China. Japan has territorial disputes in the East China Sea with China. I'm happy to talk about if people like details about that, or the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. And they've also become involved in territorial disputes in the South China Sea. So, first and foremost, there are implications for Japan's relationship with China. When Japan has taken other steps towards becoming a more active force in world politics, for example, seeking a seat on the UN Security Council, not a permanent seat, a rotating seat. They do have one now that they achieved, but the first time they tried to do that, it was followed by months of violent protests in China, and ultimately Japan withdrew its request, and China backed down. And about 10 years later, they were able to get that seat. China is a rapidly growing power. The military is growing, and it will be difficult for Xi Jinping to not respond forcefully if Japan is seen as remilitarizing. North Korea, I actually don't really see North Korea changing its policies towards Japan if Japan becomes more of a military power. It's already very aggressive. It's difficult to imagine a more aggressive stance. They're already shooting missiles over the Japanese mainland, and I neither think that this would spark a war or change. I think it would just be the status quo. South Korea, on the other hand, is more concerning. South Korea has, they're still in living memory, memories of Japan's very brutal occupation of South Korea, in particular the comfort women issue, property expropriation issues, issues of South Koreans being oppressed into service, South Korean prisoners of war being treated horribly as were American prisoners of war during the war. And South Korea will see Japan's constitutional revision as a security threat. Right now, South Korea and Japan are having really quite friendly relations and have become closer together in response to this North Korean crisis. Constitutional revision at this time is going to undermine the trust that they are very, very slowly building. And that I see that as very, sort of one of the more perilous situations. At the same time, what we, I think, can expect to see with regard, if constitutional revision moves forward, and there is more of a militaristic stance in Japan, is that we'll see other kinds of retaliation from China. Maybe from South Korea, but particularly from China. So these are images from 2005, 2010, and 2012, when Japan had issues over the Senkaku-Diaoyu Islands, the UN Security Council, and a variety of other sort of history issues between the two countries. There are wide-scale protests, anti-Japanese protests in China. In 2012, there were in over 200 cities in China. Probably millions of young and old Chinese in the streets, smashing Japanese cars, boycotting Japanese products, and sentiment between the two countries has plunged. Similar to the United States, Japan has very close economic ties and economic interdependence with China, but actions like this will undermine those. And I feel sadly confident with my prediction that we're going to see probably degrading of economic ties in the region due to Japan's Abe's domestic politics of changing the constitution. So I don't really like making predictions, but I'm making some predictions today. So you can tell me, like in 2 years, that I'm wrong. So there's going to be a very robust debate in Japan coming up on national security and constitutional revision. And I think I say 50-50 on constitutional revision. This sounds like I'm hedging. I have never, so usually I'd say, maybe like 5% chance. So this is very high. This is higher than it's ever been. Now things could go very wrong for Abe, in particular if there is, for example, economic retaliation from this debate. I can see Japanese either buckling down and saying, you have no right to tell us what to do. Like, this is our sovereignty. Or they could say, this isn't worth it. We already have the self-defense forces. Why are we damaging our relationship with our top economic partner over something that just solidifies the status quo? So I could really see that going either way, but the Japanese public is going to be very responsive to what happens, particularly in China. There will be an angry response from China, and that will include economic retaliation, and that will damage the economy of Japan. If it's wide scale enough, it might damage the economy of other neighboring countries, maybe even including the United States, since we're so intertwined with Japanese supply chains. But throughout all of this, I have full confidence that the United States-Japan alliance will remain strong. It is the cornerstone of U.S. policy in the Asia-Pacific region, and the amount of the knowledge and number of people both serving in the U.S. military as well as in our bureaucracy and in sort of the supporting institutions are all very committed to that, and I think that will continue. So thank you very much for your time. I welcome your questions. If you have questions about North Korea, you can talk about that too. But thank you very much.